Okay, so let's talk about recording in Pro Tools and some troubleshooting tips. So I was thinking about what to cover for today's video, and what I actually did is I went to YouTube and I typed in Pro Tools won't, and then I looked at what the autofill results were. And so it seems like a lot of people are searching for Pro Tools won't record, something along the lines of Pro Tools won't get signal from the microphone, recording, stuff like that. So that seemed like one of the more searched topics here on YouTube. So I figured I would just talk about that a little bit today. I do have a couple of videos where I talked about like setting up to record. So I will link to those in the cards up at the top of the screen somewhere. But today I figured we'll talk a little bit more about troubleshooting, and then also about like getting your setup done from a more technical perspective. I don't know if technical is right, but we're not going to talk about mic placement and stuff like that. We're going to talk more about just getting Pro Tools so that it's functioning properly. Okay, and so a lot of the stuff that I'm going to be covering today, I actually do cover with my film students. What I'm going to do is actually take the notes that we create in class and create a handout for my Patreon patrons. So that's going to be available on my website, and then I'm also going to post it to Patreon for you guys. So thank you for being a Patreon patron. That will be available to you. And I also do already have a handout on my website for Patreon patrons, and it's preparing to record input gain. So that will also be relevant to this topic. So check that out if you haven't already, if you're a Patreon patron. And thank you. All right, so I have this example session that I just created for the purposes of this video. So the first thing I always do is Command-Shift-N, create a new track, and then I will hold Command and use the arrow keys to make a stereo master fader. That's basically the first thing I do for every single session that I work on. If you're mixing in stereo, which most people are, yeah, I'd say most people are mixing in stereo, then that's going to be the first thing you're going to want to do is create a stereo master fader so that you can monitor what's going out your left and right speakers. So, and just to make sure that everything is flowing smoothly within Pro Tools, there are a few things that you'll want to check that are outside of Pro Tools first. So you'll, for example, want to make sure your computer's on. That's pretty obvious. But you'll also want to make sure that any of your external hardware that you need to run Pro Tools is on. So for example, if you have an interface, you'll want to turn on that interface, because if you're plugging a microphone into that interface, you need that interface on to get signal, right? So for example, I have my Universal Audio, the Apollo interface. So I make sure that is on. I make sure my mic preamps are on. Right now I'm using a Great River preamp. Sorry, I'm like turning away from the mic and talking, but you just want to make sure that all of that gear is on. And what you always want to do, and I try to reinforce this to my students very heavily, is that you want to make sure that your speakers are turned on last and they're turned off first. And so the idea behind that is you don't want anything power cycling, so turning on or off while the speakers are on, right? So when that happens, sometimes there can be a surge of power, and that can cause the speakers to pop, and that's bad for the speakers over time. So you want to always make sure that your speakers are on last or they're off first. That's one of the more crucial things in making sure that you're not breaking your gear. There's doing that. There's making sure that you're not sending phantom power out to ribbon microphones. A lot of other things with our gear, if we turn it on or off in the wrong order, it's not necessarily going to break something the way over and over turning on your speakers in the wrong order can sometimes do. All right, so once you've made sure that you've turned on your computer and any additional outboard gear that you need, so like an interface, your speakers, stuff like that, you'll also, if you're going to be using a condenser microphone, a lot of us do use condenser microphones in the studio, you'll want to make sure that you have phantom power on the preamp that you're plugging the microphone into. And remembering that phantom power button is actually one of the more common things that my students tend to forget to do, right? So it's a good thing to make sure, if you're a beginner, to check that you have that on if you're using a condenser microphone. So a lot of times that's one of the first things that I have them show me if they call me up and they're like, I'm in the sound booth, I can't get signal, help, So that's a good thing to check. I always just think about the flow that the signal's taking. So you have someone making sound in the sound booth. That's a good step, right? Once you know that you have someone making sound in the sound booth, you want to make sure that the microphone is plugged in, that the microphone cable is plugged into the wall. I'm thinking of the school sound booth here, but you can adapt it to whatever your environment is. It then goes through the wall and it comes out in the control room. You want to then make sure that you're plugged into your interface or your preamp, right? So you either have the preamp on your interface or you have a dedicated interface. So for my students, A lot of times that's making sure that the microphone's plugged into the input 1 on the inbox, and then they have to make sure that they have phantom power plugged in on the inbox, because one of the microphones that we almost always have standing in the sound booth is a condenser microphone. So they do have to make sure that that's turned on. And especially with the newer M boxes, like some of the older ones, they would retain phantom power if you turned the M box on and off. But the newer ones, what they do is if you turn them, the whole M box off and then back on, the phantom power will not light up again. So the phantom power will not become active automatically. You have to turn it on. And that's actually good. That's a safety thing. Like if you plugged in a ribbon microphone and then you plugged in, like turned on the M box and you didn't realize that the last person had phantom power on, you can fry the ribbon microphone. So it's really good that it does. I think it's good that it does that. But anyway, you want to make sure that you have that phantom power button on if you have a condenser microphone. Otherwise, don't worry about it. And at this point, you should already have turned on your speakers or plugged in your headphones and turned up the volume knob for either the headphone output or the main speaker output on your interface, right? So check those things. If you're just plugging into a computer, then you'll want to make sure that you have the volume up on your computer and your headphones plugged in or whatever you're using, right? So you can adapt it to whatever you're doing here, whatever your setup looks like. But anyway, that's when we get to opening up Pro Tools, creating that stereo master fader. And then the other thing that I tell my students to do is to create Command-Shift-N to create a new track and create a mono audio track. And this is another thing that people tend to mess up is they will create a stereo track. And if you're recording one microphone, you only have one signal coming in, and that means you only need a mono track. If you create a stereo track, what's going to happen is you'll probably have like the left channel with all your signal on it, and the right channel will have no signal on it. So then you're creating twice as much data as you need to create, and you're going to have everything pan to the left. And I actually have a video that talks about that topic. That also happens a lot with people that are just starting to use like on location recording devices. So I will link to that in the cards for you guys too. So if you're just recording one microphone, you create a mono audio track. I'm just going to hit enter here. So now I've created my track. And so now what you want to do is you want to just make sure that Pro Tools is communicating with your interface, with your device that has the microphone plugged into it. So what I like to do is I go setup, playback engine. And I just want to make sure that my playback engine is set to the device that I'm actually using. So right now it looks good to me. I have my universal audio is my my interface. So that's what I want it to be looking at. But you can see here, if I click and see all the different options, then there are a few different options that can pop up here. And sometimes computers will switch over to using a different device and you have to switch it back to your actual interface. So like I'll switch to Zoom audio when I'm in a Zoom class teaching my students. Pro Tools Aggregate is great for when you don't have an interface plugged in, right? So that's a good option if you don't have an interface plugged in. I never want to use MacBook Pro microphone or speakers. That's just not necessary if you have an interface. So you just want to make sure that you have it set to the proper device. So if you have an M box, you would want to choose the M box option here. If you have, some kind of, I don't know, there's a million options out there. I'm not going to go through all of them. But basically, you want to choose your interface that you have plugged the microphone into on this option. And if you do change the option, it's going to ask you to save and close, and it'll restart your session. That's fine. I'm going to hit cancel because I didn't change anything here. But just know that that's totally okay, and it's good that it restarts when you actually change things. So I'm going to hit OK. So now I know that Pro Tools is communicating with my interface because it's using my interface as the playback engine. So I know that it has proper communication going and it should be able to get signal from that interface. All right, so another thing that my students tend to very often forget is that it's not just good enough to tell Pro Tools to look at that device. You have to also say, hey, I'm recording to whatever track specifically, and I need to set the input for that track as well. So the way we do that is, if you look here, I have my input-output, so I-O, input-output options here. If you don't have those options visible in the edit window, you can click this drop down, and then you can choose I-O right here. So, if I click it, it disappears, click it, reappears. So I have my input and output panels here. The top one's always the input. The bottom one's always the output. The few exceptions, master faders only have one, right? But you can also access these input-output panels if you go to the mix window. So I just did Command equals to switch over to the mix window, and you can see them right here. So I-O, right? Input-output. So what you want to do is wherever you find it, whether it's here in the edit window or here in the mix window, you want to click on it. So that's clicking on the top one, which is the input panel. And you want to pick the correct input for the input that you plugged your microphone into. So for me, I believe that's line 6 that I have this microphone plugged into. So I'm going to select that option. And so now I've told Pro Tools through the playback engine, I tell it, hey, look at my universal audio device or whatever that device is. Through the input panel here on the track, I'm telling it, if I record to this track, I want you to look at this specific input on my device. And now I have to tell Pro Tools which track to record to. So for example, if I had 5 different tracks, I might only want to record to this one track. So the way you do that is you click this record enable button. And so that's either here on the edit window, or if I do command equals and switch over, there's the same button right here on the mix window. So that's our record enable button. When you click that, you should see signal. So I'm going to click it. Check, check. I can see my signal. Cool. I will unclick it just because I don't want to have delay in my system from 2 iterations of my voice going right now. So that's a pretty good spot to be in when you're trying to record. You have signal, Pro Tools is acknowledging the signal, you have it routed properly. It's a really good spot to be in. Now you're ready to do your sound check. So just to kind of recap, some of the most common things that I see students messing up when they're trying to record is forgetting about this input panel. Not having the device properly set. That's a little less common because that tends to be held over from the last person that used the computer. But one of the biggest things is forgetting to press that phantom power button if it's a condenser microphone. So I would make sure you check those things for sure. Another thing that I do recommend is renaming your track before recording. So you can be like character 1, or you can name it after the instrument, or whatever helps you remember what those audio files are. And that's just because when we start to record in Pro Tools, it's going to auto name all the audio files that are generated based off of the name of this track. So it's a good thing to do. Okay, so at this point, I tell my students to make sure, if they haven't already, to make sure that whoever's working as their talent in the actual sound booth has, been offered water, has the script if they need the script, has, knows what they're going to be doing if they're performing a musical piece or what have you. So just check in with your talent at this point. And then what I like to do is ask them to start warming up and start rehearsing whatever it is that they're going to be recording. And at some point in the process, either if we're doing a short sound check, then it doesn't, you can ask them to do this immediately. But if you're doing more of a longer sound check, then I would have them ask them to do this partway through the sound check. But I would definitely have them perform the loudest part of whatever they're performing, because one of the things you want to do is you want to set the levels based on them actually performing whatever the piece is, right? If they decide to perform something that's much quieter than what you're actually recording, then you're setting your levels isn't going to be as useful, right? So you want them to perform the actual piece that they're performing for the recording. And then you also want to make sure that you're not going to clip and you're not going to risk clipping while recording. And so one of the ways you do that is you have them perform the loudest part of the piece, because clipping, if you guys aren't familiar, I'm sure most of you guys are, but it's when it basically the audio coming into the system surpasses the threshold of the digital audio system. And so what happens then is we get waveforms that have been cut off. And I might have a video on clipping, I'm not sure, but I'll link to it if I do. But basically, from a practical standpoint, you're clipping if your tracks are lighting up this top little rectangle here at the top of the meter. So like on the master fader, it's red. On older versions of Pro Tools, it's red. On newer versions of Pro Tools, it looks a little different sometimes. We have the orange light that lights up on regular tracks. But basically, you don't want the audio to be surpassing the threshold of that digital audio can handle, right? You don't want cut off waveforms. That causes distortion. You can actually hear it if it's bad enough. So we just want to avoid the clipping. So have them perform the loudest part of their piece, set the levels based on that. So what I tell my students is, I'll show you in a second here, but basically when you're setting your levels, you want to be controlling the gain knob on the preamp. So that's my actual preamp that's over here, the physical device that's over here. And you want to be monitoring the levels in Pro Tools and listening to while you're setting those levels. And what I tell them to do, and I'll show you here in a second, is to make sure that all or most of their audio is surpassing the green section of this meter here. And if they're kind of living comfortably in the yellow, maybe a little bit into the orange, then that's a really good place to be living. You just want to make sure that you don't clip, and you don't want your levels to be crazy low either. So there are some different like varying philosophies about that. A lot of the guys that grew up like especially pre-digital days, they'll tell you to get it as high as possible without clipping, without distorting. You know, if it's on analog, they have distortion. Sometimes you want distortion, but what they'll do is they'll tell you to get as loud as possible without going into that distortion realm. And one of the reasons why they say to do that is because when we had things like tape, the actual tape would introduce a great deal of noise into the system. So basically, you want to have the highest signal to noise ratio with something like a tape system, because the system itself is introducing noise. Whereas with digital, we don't have digital introducing noise the same way that something like tape does. So we don't have to worry about that quite as much, but you don't want your levels to be super low either. As anyone that has recorded really quiet like this will tell you, if you record really low on the meters here, what's going to happen is you're going to probably want to boost it up at some point to get a healthy mix level later in the process. But the problem is that if you have a low signal to noise ratio, you're boosting the room noise from the actual recording in addition to the actual wanted signal. So the actual person talking, the actual instrument, whatever it is. So what happens is you boost up that whatever the thing is that you've recorded, and you're going to hear a lot of room noise in addition to what you actually want to hear. All right, so once you've asked the performer to perform the loudest parts, you might have started to do a sound check a little bit, you might not have. But basically what you want to do is, I will show you here, you turn on this record enable button so that now Pro Tools knows, hey, I want to record to this track and not these tracks, right? Because these don't have the record enable button selected. And then what you want to do is just watch these levels and adjust your preamp. So right now mine's kind of low. Actually, I tend to do that because I'm not monitoring while I'm recording my YouTube. So I record a little bit low and then I crank it up in post. But if you're monitoring and actually functioning as an audio engineer for this session, you might want it to be a little higher up here into the yellow. So if I talk really loud, see, we have, oh, it's light green. I forgot it was light green. So if I talk really loud, you can see how there are different tiers on this actual meter. I can actually crank my preamp up a little bit so you guys can kind of see. What that looks like. But you just kind of want to look at these levels, look at these meters, and make sure that you're not clipping and you're not super low. I'll uncheck that for a second just to talk. So once your talent's settled, your levels are set, you're happy with everything, what you want to do is you want to go ahead and record, and you want to try to not change those levels too much while you're recording, because that can actually change like the texture, the quality of the sound that you're actually recording. So that's why we do that sound check before we actually start to record. Once you've done the sound check and you're ready to go, I would check with your performer, make sure that they're also ready to go. And then once you're both comfortable and ready to go, you can just hit record and start actually recording. So I'm going to go back into record enable mode, which is where you should be at this point. And you can start recording a few different ways. So you can click this button here and then hit this button. It's kind of like an old school tape recorder where you hit, hold down the record button and then hit play. So you can start recording that way. You can hit spacebar to stop. You can also start recording by hitting 3 on the numeric keypad. That's probably one of the more common ways to start recording. You can also sometimes, depending on the OS, hit command spacebar or hit F12 if the OS doesn't override those key commands. But there are a few different ways you can actually start recording. So basically, you tell Pro Tools, record to this track specifically when I hit record, and you can record enable multiple tracks. And then once you've told it that, you got to tell it to record for the whole session. So basically there are a few different ways that you can start recording, but 3 on the numeric keypad is my favorite way to do it if you have a numeric keypad. And it seems to be the more common way. But other than that, there are a few different ways. So you can usually get it to start recording using one of these methods. Another thing that I tell my students just to be safe, especially if you're on a slower computer, is to actually start your recording and then tell the performer once you actually see the numbers start to move on the recording, you actually see it start to generate audio, then tell the performer that you are recording. So especially if they're not lining up with anything, if you're not punching in or punching out, stuff like that, that's more time sensitive. I would let it actually start recording for a second and make sure that it's going before you actually tell them. Because otherwise, if it's a slow computer, sometimes it can take a few seconds for it to kick in and start going. And if you tell the performer as soon as you hit record that it's recording, they might actually start before the recording starts. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And then, while you're recording, you want to make sure that you're monitoring that clip light indicator, you're monitoring your levels, you're monitoring any other sounds that might come into play. So like wind bursts, wow, I can't say that word. Aspirated phonemes, stuff like that. If they bump the mic stand, or, there are a few other ways that like a low bump can come into play in the sound. You just want to be listening and notice those things so you know if you have to do a retake. But basically, other than that, you want to make sure that you get multiple takes just in case, right? Especially if you're new to listening for those things, like those little weird sounds that can come into play and become an issue in your final recording. I would just get multiple takes just to be safe. You want to always, always, always save your session. So what I tell my students to do is do Command S to save. I've had students do like save copy in and save as and save different versions of their session elsewhere on the computer and create this horrible rat's nest full of things. So I don't recommend doing that unless you're very comfortable with it, with the difference between something like a save as, a save copy in, and a save. I might have some videos on that I will link up above if I do have them. But what I recommend doing is just Command S. That will save your session where it's currently located. You won't accidentally save your session outside of the session folder and cause a mess. But always save your session, especially right after recording. Always, always save your session. Okay, and then the final point that I make to my students when I'm talking about actually recording is to make sure that you go file and close your session out. This is for Pro Tools specifically, like a lot of things that I'm talking about here, but you want to make sure that you actually close that session, because what'll happen is, first of all, if you go to close that session and you have not saved recently, or if you made a change since your last save, it's going to notify you and it's going to ask you if you want to save. So that's really good. It's a good way to make sure that whatever you're transferring to a different computer is the most up-to-date version of your session. And then the other thing is I see students a lot of times closing out like the mix and the edit window here using this little red dot. And what happens then is their session's still open, and the next person that closes Pro Tools might go, quit Pro Tools, and it's going to ask them if they want to save. They might save it, and what'll happen is when my students open up their session, they're not going to see any windows and they're going to be very confused, and it's just because they have the mix and the edit windows closed. So I do recommend actually going to file and close session, especially to make sure that you have the more up-to-date version of your session when you then go to transfer that session folder elsewhere. It's just a good habit to have, I think. And then other than that, another good habit that I recommend that I personally do is I will, whenever I finish working on a project for the day, I will make sure that I save it, I close the session completely, and then I back it up somewhere. So I back up online, and then I also back up to an external hard drive that I have here on my desk. But just make sure that you back it up wherever you choose to back things up. And then other than that, if you're working in someone else's studio or you're working in your own studio, if you're done working, you probably want to shut everything down. So the big important thing to remember is to make sure that you shut down your speakers first, right? Because you don't want to be power cycling anything while those speakers are on. So shut off those speakers and then shut off all the rest of your gear, and depending on your setup, you might have a different order of operations here for your gear. So that does depend a little bit on your setup, but the big takeaway is to turn off those speakers first. But yeah, I think that's basically it. I think in terms of if you're not getting signal and you're having trouble getting signal into Pro Tools or being able to record in Pro Tools, I would just go through each of these steps and make sure that you have checked each of these steps and everything looks good. Let me know if you're still having trouble. If anyone out there in YouTube land is still having trouble, you can always comment on this video, and I do try to reply to all my comments. But other than that, just to reiterate some of the big takeaways here, some of the most common things that I see students doing that make it hard to get signal in or make them unable to record they will not have set the playback engine to the device, right? So you want to make sure that's your interface, whatever has the microphone plugged in. You want to go to the track that you're recording to, and you want to make sure that you're setting the input panel to the actual input for the microphone, where the microphone is plugged into. You want to hit record enable, or you're not going to see any signal, right? And what are the other common things? One of the most common things is not turning on phantom power on the actual interface. And a lot of times the phantom power button is labeled as plus 48 volts, so plus 48V. So that's one of the ways you can look for that phantom power button on your interface. But you can also look it up for your interface and find where it is with a quick Google search. So I think those are the most common things that I've seen with beginners where they're not able to get any signal into Pro Tools. I hope that helps most people out there. But let me know in the comments below if that doesn't help you and you're still struggling. And other than that, if you like this video, please like, comment, subscribe to my channel. Check out my Patreon. It's patreon.com/CatoNoise. And my patrons get access to the additional content that I mentioned in this video. They also get early release videos. They get videos that are only for Patreon patrons a little bit, as much as I can. I try to help out my Patreon patrons because you guys are a huge help to me. So check that out if you're curious about that. And I think that's about it. I come out with new videos every Wednesday, and thank you for watching. Okay. I feel like my voice is going through this whole video, and I don't know how I feel about it. Yeah, I don't know what else to say. I'm going to do another video now.